You've spent years trying to be the right version of yourself, successful, capable, likable, but beneath it all, something doesn't feel whole. There's a quiet disconnect, like you're performing a life you didn't fully choose. Why do certain emotions feel foreign or threatening? Why do your relationships repeat the same painful patterns, no matter how self-aware you think you are? What if the version of you've been protecting is actually the mask, not the self? This video won't offer quick answers, but it will ask the right questions, ready to look beneath the surface. You probably don't remember when it started, when you first realized certain parts of yourself weren't welcome. Maybe it was when your curiosity was labeled as disruptive, or when your sensitivity was called weakness. Over time, you began shaping yourself to survive the environment around you, not intentionally, just instinctively, because approval meant safety, because rejection, even subtle, left a mark. That shaping became your personality, your identity, or at least what you thought was your identity. In Jungian terms, this version of you is called the persona, the mask you wear to function in the world. It's not fake exactly, it's just selective. It's the version of you that gets rewarded. That makes sense to others. That keeps things smooth. You might be seen as the responsible one, the calm one, the achiever, the helper. And because those roles brought you belonging, or at least less conflict, you held on to them. You got good at them, so good that you began to forget what existed underneath. But here's the problem. The persona was never meant to be you. It was meant to serve you, to help you interface with the world, like clothing you wear in different situations. It was never meant to replace your deeper self. When you live only through the persona, something subtle happens. You start to feel hollow after social interactions. You find yourself exhausted from being on all the time. You might look in the mirror and not really feel connected to who's looking back. And then, quietly, the questions begin to form. Do people actually know me? Would they still care if I wasn't performing this version of me? A man who was taught to always be composed may find himself unable to express sadness, even to his partner. A woman who grew up needing to be agreeable may struggle to say what she truly wants, even in small decisions. Not because they lack depth, but because their persona learned to protect them by hiding it. You might not even recognize how much of your daily behavior is performance. The smile you give when you're uncomfortable, the silence you offer when you disagree, the enthusiasm you feign when you're actually numb. Jung warned of this exact danger, that the persona, if not examined, becomes overdeveloped. It starts to dominate your psyche. And then, what was once a tool becomes a cage. This isn't about throwing away your persona. You need it. We all do. The issue is when it replaces you, when you forget that there's someone underneath it, someone you haven't spent time with in years. So ask yourself quietly, without judgment, who did you become in order to be loved? And who did you leave behind in the process? This is the first layer, and shedding it won't be comfortable. But awareness is the beginning, not of fixing, but of remembering. You don't need to force anything today, just notice. When you act, who are you acting as? When you speak, who is doing the speaking? This chapter isn't about guilt. It's about recognition. Recognition of the self you've been living as, and the self you've forgotten to meet. Everything looks fine, maybe even better than fine. You've met many of your goals, professionally, socially, or within your family. You do what's expected of you. You stay productive. You get things done. And yet, you feel disconnected from it all. This isn't dramatic despair. It's more subtle, a quiet absence. You go through your day like you're playing a part in someone else's life. You laugh at the right moments, answer the right questions, keep up appearances. But when you're alone, there's a kind of numbness, a blank, space where meaning used to be. If you've felt this, you're not alone. Jung believed this sense of hollowness often emerges when our life has been built too far from the core self. When the ego, the part of you that manages, the external world, succeeds, but the inner world remains neglected. Think about it. If you've spent years building a life based on your persona, your internal compass may have been silenced in the process. And the unconscious, the deeper layer of the psyche, begins to push back. Not with words, but with symptoms. Fatigue that can't be explained, anxiety without a cause, restlessness, emptiness, a quiet suspicion that something is missing. A man in his 40s, who's reached a stable position in his career, may find himself lying awake at night, unable to explain why he dreads the next day. A woman who appears cheerful in every group photo may feel a deep loneliness the moment she walks back into her house. These emotional mismatches, the gaps between how your life looks and how it feels, are not character flaws. They are signals, clues that your outer life has drifted away from your inner one. But many people override these signals. They double down, they try harder, they distract, perform, overachieve, or numb. Because listening, really listening, would mean admitting that the life they've worked so hard to build may not be aligned with who they really are. So ask yourself gently, what parts of your life feel strangely distant, even when you're fully inside them? What would happen if you stopped pushing through and started listening instead? This discomfort isn't failure. It's the beginning of awareness. The psyche doesn't punish you. It nudges you. It whispers when something essential has been lost in the noise, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. There's a quiet exhaustion that comes from being who you've always been, especially when that version of you no longer feels true. You find yourself saying yes when you want to say no, smiling when you feel nothing, being helpful, agreeable, competent, even when you're breaking inside. This is what happens when a role outlives its usefulness. Maybe you were the good child, the one who never caused trouble, or the strong one, the one who kept the family together. Maybe you were the overachiever, the caregiver, the fixer, the peacekeeper. These roles helped you survive. In many ways, they protected you. But over time, they became expectations, not just from others, but from yourself. Now, even as an adult, you may feel bound to that version of you, afraid to disappoint, afraid to step out of the script. You might wonder, if I stop being this person, will I still be loved? In Jungian psychology, this is the moment where the persona becomes rigid, no longer a flexible mask, but a self-imposed identity. You're not just wearing the mask, you've fused with it. And yet, some deeper part of you, the authentic self, starts pressing against it, quietly, persistently, asking to be seen. You might notice this tension when you're asked to make a choice and you freeze, not because you don't know what to do, but because you don't know what you want. You might notice it in moments of resentment, when everyone leans on you, and you realize you've trained them to do exactly that. A man who's been the provider his whole life may start to feel invisible, not because others devalue him, but because he's never learned how to show anything else. A woman who's been the emotional glue of her family may find herself secretly fantasizing about disappearing, not because she doesn't care, but because no one ever asked her what she needs. These roles feel permanent, but they're not. They're habits. Deep ones, yes, but still habits. And habits can be unlearned. So the question becomes, who are you when you stop playing the part? What if letting go of that role doesn't mean failure, but freedom? The people around you may resist your shift. That's normal. But the deeper risk is not rejection. It's remaining loyal to a version of yourself that no longer feels alive. Jung would say the path forward isn't rebellion. It's integration. You don't have to destroy the roles you once played. You simply have to stop letting them define the whole of you. The real self is still there, under the layers, quiet, patient, and waiting. You've probably noticed it. The same arguments, the same kinds of relationships, the same emotional patterns. You tell yourself, this time will be different, but it's not. The faces may change, the context may shift, but the pattern remains. This isn't coincidence, it's repetition, and it usually means you're dealing with the shadow. Jung described the shadow as everything about ourselves that we repress, deny, or disown, not because it's inherently bad, but because it didn't fit the image we needed to uphold. And what's rejected doesn't disappear. It moves into the unconscious, where it begins to shape your life indirectly. That means the anger you refuse to feel might show up as passive aggression. The vulnerability you avoid might reappear in your relationships, through others who expose it for you. The shame you buried may leak into how you treat your body, your ambitions, or your closest connections. A woman who was punished for expressing anger as a child might now attract partners who rage freely, while she stays silent and resentful. A man who had to be the strong one growing up may find himself quietly undermining people who show weakness, not because he dislikes them, but because they carry what he can't face in himself. This is projection, one of the most common ways the shadow reveals itself. You unconsciously assign your disowned traits onto others, allowing you to keep your self-image intact while still reacting to those traits, just at a distance. But here's the truth. Until you recognize your shadow, you'll keep circling the same emotional terrain. You'll keep meeting it in people, conflicts, and inner sabotage, not because you're broken, but because your psyche wants to be whole. Jung believed that what we repress returns, not to punish us, but to be integrated. The repetition is your psyche trying to get your attention and trying to show you what you're avoiding. So ask yourself, what emotions or traits in others do you react to most strongly? And could those reactions be pointing to something unacknowledged in yourself? This chapter isn't about blame. It's about self-honesty. The patterns you keep falling into are not random. They're maps. And if you're willing to trace them inward, they'll lead you directly to the parts of yourself that are asking to come home. You know how to be presentable, empathetic, even emotionally available, in a way. You might be the kind of person others open up to easily. And on the surface, your relationships seem strong. But under that, something's missing. You feel distant, misunderstood. You offer support, yet feel invisible. You share stories, but not what actually matters. You've learned how to perform connection, but you rarely feel it. This often begins in early environments where being emotionally open didn't feel safe. Maybe your needs were minimized, or your feelings were too much for someone else to handle. So you adapted. You became someone who anticipated others' emotions, someone who soothed, helped, or entertained, instead of revealing. Jung would say, this is the persona taking the place of intimacy. You show others a version of yourself that's polished, socially functional, and well-liked, but not deeply known. Not because you're being manipulative, but because the real you doesn't feel like a safe thing to expose. You might notice this pattern when people thank you for being there for them, but never really ask about you. Or when you're in a relationship, but avoid being emotionally vulnerable unless it's on your terms. Or when conversations stay meaningful, yet always within the realm of ideas, never embodied experience. A man might speak about trauma like a textbook, but go numb when asked how it actually felt. A woman might know everyone else's needs, but panic when asked, what do you want? When intimacy becomes performance, connection starts to feel more like a role than a relationship. And the cost is emotional isolation, even in the middle of closeness. So ask yourself, when was the last time you truly let someone see you? Not the curated version, but the one that doesn't always know what to say? What happens inside you when someone gets too close? Jung's path wasn't about surface comfort, it was about depth, and that depth requires risk. True intimacy begins where the persona ends. But here's the quiet truth. The real you is more lovable than the one you perform. You just haven't tested it yet. You finally have a quiet moment. No tasks, no emails, no demands. But instead of relief, you feel anxious, restless, like you're doing something wrong, like you're falling behind, or worse, being lazy. This feeling, the guilt that shows up when you stop being productive, is one of the more subtle signals that your identity has become tangled with your usefulness. Somewhere along the way, you learned that being still meant being unworthy. That rest is earned only through exhaustion. That being enough is something you prove, not something you are. In Jungian terms, this reflects a life dominated by the ego, the part of the psyche shaped by expectations, norms, and roles. The ego craves approval and structure. It thrives on measurable success. But it cannot rest, because rest doesn't generate validation. It doesn't feed the image. It just is. You may have built an entire identity around being dependable, capable, efficient, and there's value in that. But when the doing becomes compulsive, when you can't stop without feeling like you're disappearing, that's not discipline. That's fear. A woman who is praised for being the high achiever might now burn herself out managing everything, her job, her relationships, her family, and yet still feel like she's not doing enough. A man who was only seen when he produced results may now feel invisible the moment he pauses. These aren't isolated cases. They're reflections of a broader psychic split, the divide between the human self and the performative self. So ask yourself quietly, who are you without your tasks? What comes up for you when there's nothing to fix, no one to please, nothing to earn? Jung emphasized the importance of reconnecting with the unconscious, the inner world that holds rest, reflection, and renewal. But if your life has been shaped entirely around the outer world, the measurer, the visible, the productive, then turning inward can feel unsafe, but it's necessary, not just for your mental health, but for your wholeness. You don't need permission to rest. You need permission to exist without proving anything. That permission can only come from within. You go through your day with precision. You manage your responsibilities. You speak clearly. You're presentable. But when things go quiet, when the external world stops demanding your attention, there's an unsettling emptiness. You can't quite explain it. It's not boredom. It's not depression. It's more like disconnection, like being a guest in your own inner life. You may notice that you don't really know how you're feeling, or that silence makes you uncomfortable, or that you rarely remember your dreams, and when you do, they feel foreign. This is what it means to be cut off from the unconscious, the inner landscape Jung saw as essential to a whole life. In our modern world, we're trained to value what's external: clarity, action, logic, productivity. But the unconscious doesn't operate on those terms. It moves in images, symbols, emotions, instincts. If you've spent years avoiding your deeper world, it starts to retreat. You may have gotten good at functioning. You may be respected, even admired. But if you've sacrificed inner connection for outer success, there will be a cost. That cost is estrangement from yourself. A man in his 30s might feel like life is on track, yet notice that he avoids being alone, because when he's alone, the silence feels heavy. A woman who's always been in control may realize she can't answer the question, "What do you feel right now?" without freezing or deflecting. These aren't problems to fix. They're invitations to return. To remember that your mind is not the whole of you, that your psyche includes emotional nuance, forgotten memories, silent longings, unresolved pain, hidden gifts. Jung believed that dreams, imagination, art, and deep feeling were bridges to the unconscious, but to access them, you must slow down, listen, become curious about your reactions, your desires, your aversions, not to judge them, but to know them. So ask yourself, when was the last time you truly felt something? Not performed it, not explained it, but felt it? What's underneath your numbness? Beneath the routines? Beneath the calm? You're not broken. You're disconnected. And disconnection can be healed, not by doing more, but by turning inward, patiently and honestly. The inner world may feel like a stranger now, but it remembers you. It always has. At some point, something shifts. The mask you've worn, sometimes for years, stops working. Not all at once, but in quiet, inconvenient ways. You forget how to keep smiling. You lose interest in keeping up appearances. You can't summon the energy to be the version of yourself everyone expects. For some, it happens through burnout. For others, after a loss. For many, it's simply the wear and tear of years spent performing a version of life that doesn't reflect the person inside. You might not call it a breakdown. You might just feel tired, disoriented, unmotivated in areas you used to take pride in. Relationships begin to feel strained. Small talk feels unbearable. There's a quiet panic, not loud but persistent, asking, "What's wrong with me?" Jung viewed this moment not as pathology, but as initiation. When the persona, the socially constructed self, begins to crack, it's often the first invitation toward real psychological development. This unraveling isn't failure. It's the psyche creating space for something more, honest, to emerge. But the experience can feel destabilizing. You've relied on this identity. You've built friendships around it, careers, marriages. The mask may be fragile, but it was familiar. When it begins to fall apart, there's usually a reflex to fix it. You may try to bounce back, return to your routines, push harder, but none of it feels right anymore. Because the mask no longer fits, and deep down, you know it. A man who built a life as the dependable provider might find himself paralyzed by the question, "What do I want?" A question he's never had the freedom to ask. A woman who's always been the emotional caretaker may wake up one morning and feel utterly disconnected, not from others, but from herself. So ask yourself, what would happen if you stopped trying to pull yourself together? What if this disorientation is not the end, but the beginning of something truer? Jung said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But when the persona collapses, avoidance is no longer an option. This moment is not about rebuilding the mask. It's about meeting what's been waiting underneath. This part is raw, unfamiliar. There's no script to follow, no role to step into, just you, without the social filters, without the old reflexes, without the armor you've worn for so long. And it can feel deeply uncomfortable because the real self is not polished. It doesn't always know what to say. It has needs, wounds, regrets, desires that were buried so long ago you forgot they existed. Now they start surfacing, sometimes through emotion, sometimes through memory, often through silence. You might start asking questions that make others uncomfortable, or that make you uncomfortable. What do I actually want? Not what looks good, but what feels right. What relationships are based on who I really am, and which are based on who I've pretended to be? What parts of myself have I abandoned just to keep peace? This is what Jung called the confrontation with the self. It's the moment when you stop living outward in and start turning inward out. It's not about self-improvement. It's about self-encounter. The kind that doesn't flatter your image, but deepens your understanding. And here's the thing. The real self isn't always easy to face. It carries both light and shadow. It includes the parts of you you're proud of and the parts you've avoided for years. You might discover a hidden well of creativity, but also a backlog of grief. You might find strength you didn't know you had, alongside fear you've been numbing. But this is the beginning of integration. You're no longer trying to be enough. You're trying to be whole. A man might sit with his sadness for the first time in his life and realize that what he thought was weakness is actually depth. A woman might finally allow herself to feel anger, not to destroy, but to reclaim the power she gave away when she stayed silent. So ask yourself honestly, when you take off the mask, who's there? And what would it look like to live from that place, not just visit it? This phase is not performative. It's quiet, sometimes messy, but it's where real healing begins. The ego resists this. It wants to keep you functional, palatable, in control. But the self wants something more: truth, wholeness, alignment. And if you're here, really here, you're already moving toward it. This isn't a transformation story, not in the way you might have hoped. You don't walk away from this process as a new person. You walk away as someone you were always meant to be, but got separated from. Integration, in Jungian terms, means allowing the parts of yourself that were split off, denied, ignored, over-adapted, to return to consciousness and take their place in your identity. It means no longer organizing your entire life around being liked, impressive, or in control. Instead, you start living from a place of inner alignment. This process doesn't look dramatic. It often shows up in small shifts. You stop forcing conversations that don't feel real. You no longer agree to things just to keep the peace. You begin to notice when you're performing and when you're actually present. The old personas still arise sometimes, but now you can see them for what they are: tools, not definitions. A man housed to avoid his emotional world might now pause when he feels overwhelmed, not to shut it down, but to ask, what's really happening in me right now? A woman who always feared being too much might now speak with directness and stay connected to herself even if others don't approve. These are the markers of individuation, not perfection, not some enlightened state, but an ongoing willingness to live as a whole person, with shadow and light, limits and freedom, questions and clarity. You won't always feel understood. You may outgrow certain dynamics. You may disappoint people who preferred the version of you that never said no. But in return, something deeper takes root, an internal steadiness that doesn't depend on constant validation. Jung described individuation not as a goal, but as a lifelong path, one that requires courage, self-observation, and humility. And what it ultimately leads to is not a performance of authenticity, but the quiet capacity to live as yourself without apology or inflation. So ask yourself, gently, what have you reclaimed in this process? What no longer fits? Not because it's wrong, but because it isn't you? And what parts of you, long forgotten, are beginning to feel safe enough to return? This is not the end of the work, but it is the moment when the work begins to feel like your life. You're no longer acting like yourself. You're becoming yourself, steadily, imperfectly, and for the first time, consciously. Welcome back.